Hello and welcome to this Achates Inspires session on bridging between the executive and non-executive, particularly to those for whom this is your first session. I'm Naomi Chapman, the Deputy Director of Strategy at Achates. For those of you who don't know us, we are a leading cultural consultancy company supporting strategy at an organisation and geographical level, earned and contributed income generation, recruitment and organisational change. Achates Inspires is part of our free offer to the sector. It's a bi-monthly digital cross-arts forum for cultural sector leaders to come together and share experiences, ideas, and to explore new approaches to common problems. This is a space for senior leaders to tackle the issues of the day head-on by sharing their experiences and developing our thinking together. This session will first be broadcast at 1 p.m. on the 22nd of January, so if you're watching live at this time, do post in the comments in the chat and Achates colleagues are on hand to answer any questions you may have. In this session, we're going to be exploring how we can create a new contract between those at governance and those at executive level. Given this topic, I just wanted to flag that if you are a trustee joining us, you might be interested in the new trustee membership for Achates Community, our digital professional development platform. New modules were launched earlier this month, covering how trustees can take a purpose-led approach to governance. And today, the 22nd of January 2026, for those of you who might be watching on catch up, we are launching an offer where any staff member that has full membership to Achates Community can access a three-month trial for a trustee. It's quite a mouthful to say. Find out more via the link in the caption. So at Achates, we are really lucky to work closely with leaders, both executive and non-executive, across the sector. We work across art forms, geographies, and with organisations of all scales. And while the challenges faced by our clients do vary, a common theme is often the challenge in establishing the effective processes and relationships between our voluntary non-executive, our board, and our executive leaders. In the cultural sector, we often see these relationships get stuck in a reporting cycle, with boards looking at things through a short-term and often purely financial lens, rather than establishing a genuine dynamic partnership with the executive team that takes into account multiple forms of value. During COVID-19, many trustees took a more hands-on role in steering organisations through the challenges of the pandemic. And while that was essential at the time, for many it's left this residual expectation that board members receive immediate reports on the current situation and have a role in resolving operational issues. For the non-executive, this makes it difficult for the board to find time and space to engage strategically with all elements of the Achates triple bottom line: the work you create and curate, the impact you achieve with and for audiences, and the money. We hear from many trustees a feeling of frustration that their opportunity to make a meaningful contribution has been reduced. For the executive, this can be disempowering, leaving senior leaders feeling untrusted by their board. It can leave executives without clarity as to the overarching strategy of an organisation, preventing them from making decisions at pace and leading a wider team where everyone is pulling in the same direction. As such, we believe that as a sector, we need to establish a new contract between boards and executive teams, moving away from a relationship centred on one-way reporting towards dynamic partnerships that can be transformative for our organisations. A new charity governance code was launched in November of last year, setting out the importance of having clearly defined roles, responsibilities and expectations between the executive and non-executive, and of the board getting the balance right between support and challenge for the executive. It also speaks of the importance of the chair investing time in developing a relationship with the most senior member of staff. What it doesn't set out is what these effective relationships between senior leaders and board look like and how we can build them, the structures, processes and tools at our disposal. And it can be really hard within our own organisational context to put our finger on exactly what is causing things to work well or work badly. That's what we'll be exploring in this session. So to explore this topic, we're joined by two fantastic guest speakers who together are a pair of executive and non-executive leaders from the Women's Prize Trust. I'm really thrilled that they've agreed to share their experience and reflections with us all, both offering a deep dive into the Women's Prize Trust as a case study and sharing their wider experiences of governance relationships. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers and then ask them to share some opening thoughts before we move into a Q&A. So first we have Anna Rafferty. Anna is chair of the Women's Prize Trust, alongside her role as vice president at the Lego Group, with previous roles at the BBC and in publishing. She has significant experience on charity boards and is incoming chair at the publisher Canongate. Just let you say hi and wave, Anna.
Hi, hello everybody. Very
Thanks,
glad.
Anna. And she's joined by Claire Shanahan, the Women's Prize Trust Executive Director. Claire has experience across the publishing and the charity sector, including roles at Book Trust, Pearson and Hachette. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Looking forward to this conversation.
Fab. So I'd like to turn to both of you now and ask you to share an approach that you've used within the Women's Prize Trust to build this idea of a dynamic partnership. And then for each of you to give your perspective on maybe what's worked and what hasn't. Who'd like to kick us off?
Claire.
Firstly, I want to say that I feel very fortunate to have the board that I have. They are an incredible support and are there strategically and operationally to support what you were saying, Naomi. We're a fairly young charity, the Women's Prize Trust. So we were constituted in 2019. And that, of course, has meant a big learning curve for us as an organization, but a really exciting period of opportunity and development. The organization in sort of a different form, an earlier form, has been going for 30 years. So it's been a really interesting period. What I would say about the partnership between the board and the Women's Prize executive team is that it is incredibly dynamic and fluid. It is there in moments, as you say, of sort of everyday delivery, things that are needed, perhaps, yes, COVID, but also other moments of pressure. Reliable people who can be called upon to support and advise, but also ultimately in their in the true sense of their role, are there to really lead the organization. We are a very small executive team, so we are five people. And really, the organization cannot function without the huge input and contribution of our board. They are not women who show up 4 times a year for a meeting. They do much more than that. And I think through the last few years, we have really found a way of figuring out what works for us as we onboard new trustees and with those people who are really experienced and understand the organization very well, figuring out the kind of cadence of our interactions, how and what works for us as a group, but then also in smaller partnerships and pairings, particularly, for instance, with myself and Anna as executive director and chair of the board. And I think that takes time. And it feels like we're very lucky. We're in a really good place now. But of course, as we know, within the charity sector and the arts and culture sector, change is constant. So that's the thing that we're always sort of looking at and examining. I'm going to leave that there, but that felt kind of important to say and establish at the start of this conversation. Anna, anything to add?
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, obviously, I echo everything you said about my gratitude of working with an excellent both board and executive team. And I also agree, Claire, that you and I in particular, but all of us, are always learning. And we've got some things that we feel good about in terms of how we've structured our partnership and the organisation to be as effective, as it can be, but we're also always learning. So we're kind of relearning, unlearning and relearning a bit too. I think, Naomi, to talk, relate a bit to some of your intro and having thought about the conversation in advance. I was thinking a bit about, what is the risk? What is it that could go wrong in a board? And I think in previous experiences and also we could see the potential for this risk in the Women's Prize Trust at times. There's a risk in any board, I think, of firstly being transactional, so being very sort of lots of papers, lots of updates, lots of assurance, but less sort of partnerial, I think was the word you used, shared thinking. Which feels like a waste, a real waste of the opportunity and the brains and the passion around the table and frankly the time of the executive team. And the other big risk that I'm pretty alert to is that a board becomes a sort of talking shop, with lots of great, bright ideas. And Claire knows how allergic I am to this idea of people just showing up 4 times a year, throwing down a million of for instances and then walking away without action or follow through or anything like that. And that is something that I feel very confident now, actually, that we are not. And I know we'll talk a bit more in detail about that, but part of, I suppose, this setup framing that Claire and I and the trustees and the executive team have worked together on is being very clear around our expectations on all sides, so that we are, we need to be a board that contributes in the right way, so that is sense making and is supportive, and then fulfills our roles as stewards of our impact and purpose, and kind of long-term guardians, but also there with a safe space for constructive tension, and thinking with the executive team. And I think all of that has been very intentional, that we really have seen the opportunity for problems, and have worked to mitigate against them, and put some frameworks in place. So maybe we can talk a bit as we go through the questions about those.
Yeah, no, I'd love to revisit that. And just before we dive into the questions, one thing that I'd love to just follow up on is that I love that idea of having those kind of really clear expectations that everyone signs up to as part of being, whether they're on the executive or the non-executive side of that relationship. I'm just curious, is that something that was kind of developed as part of your charity formation, and that people are asked to kind of buy into when they join the board or join the organization, or is that something that's kind of live and that you update and co-create with whoever's in those roles at a given time?
I mean, I would say it's both those things. So firstly, it is very important to me, that we recruit trustees, and in the conversation and the process that we go through, to bring new trustees on board, and to continue to develop our board, that we do so with a very deliberate and intentional focus of firstly knowing what we need, what are our gaps, and what does the organisation need, and to continue to thrive, but also what those expectations will be of anybody coming on board. What I don't want ever to happen is to have a misunderstanding upfront, and for somebody to join expecting something different, and not understanding what I'm going to ask of them. So I've got over any kind of cultural cringe about being quite demanding, and because I think that clarity is really important. In fact, that's one of our principles, and it's perhaps it's between Claire and I, it's between the executive team and the board, and it's between me and other trustees. This idea about really explicitly underlining what our expectations and what our asks are going to be, so that people don't have shocks and horror. And so I have a document. I have I hope, very warm and loving and excited and enthusiastic invitation to join the Women's Prize Trust, but it comes with you should know this is what I'm really asking you. And bullet points, to be honest, where I say it will look like this. I will expect you to turn up, for instance, and in every sense of the word. So I think that it's very much upfront, but it is also true that we continue to evolve these and co-create them, with the board and with the exec team, where we continue to say, okay, what else do we now need? If we were to deep dive on a strategic challenge for the organisation now, with multiple different lenses that we could apply to whatever that is, what do we explicitly need? And is that a short-term need, or is that something that we should institute as an ongoing need, with our trustees? And we're quite, I think, transparent about those conversations, and inviting to the trustees, who represent different expertise, to advise on what's a reasonable, what's proportionate, and what not disempowering, also ask ongoing. Claire, did I miss anything there?
No, I think you've captured it perfectly. And I think you're right in that it is both. We have fine-tuned a sort of document, I would say, a sort of basis for how we would like the board to engage, but it is always evolving. And I think there is also an element of sort of a flex, a sort of a personalization or a bespoke element. There is room for that as well, of course, because not every trustee will be able to be required to want to show up in exactly the same way. So it's figuring out with each person that they can, I suppose, deliver enough of the baseline so that the board as a whole functions really well, but that everyone can bring their own working style and experience and expertise and capacity to things. And I think the sort of both of those things are important. The sort of personalization, enabling us to get the best out of people as well, to contribute fully.
Fantastic. And I love the idea of that kind of weaving through how you recruit, how you support trustees, how you might audit the board or think about the new skill sets you need. So that's really fascinating to hear about. So Anna, my next question was for you specifically, and just wanted to ask you to share how your executive team has supported you to think strategically about all elements of the Achates triple bottom line. And for those who aren't as familiar with that as I might be, that's this kind of balance between the work you create and curate, the impact you achieve with and for audiences, and the money. How do you think about those three things in equal measure?
I think that my answer perhaps follows on a little from what Claire was just talking about in terms of personalizing, in that the executive team led by Claire has ensured that we are able to curate the board's attention. So not just feed information, as I've said, but to be very intentional and very thoughtful about ensuring that the time that we have, valuable time that we have together, is spent focused on, for instance, framing a precise decision that is necessary around multiple lenses of impact, audiences, or financial or reputational concerns, that we're pretty clear, and the papers or the materials or the way that we approach a discussion will be very considered and well thought through, so that what we bring to the trustees is clear about what outcome we need, not necessarily with a conclusion, but with choices, with trade-offs, with risks that are clearly articulated in order to have a really good discussion. So I think that the board, at Claire, because the executive team is, as we say, small, so it is Claire and some other key members of the team, are now really good at that and really good at therefore focusing what we need from the board. And so we don't have a talking shop situation, we don't have a load of for instances, we have a focus on what we need to know next, with a view on how that then contributes to our long-term vision, our strategy, or a problem that we have that we may need to solve. I think I also very much appreciate our papers, actually, and the time that it takes to write the short letter, that they are succinct, that we've got a practice now of using OKRs, so that's objectives and key results, where we can really track based on an ongoing long-term vision of an objective that we have, and we may have multiple, and they're sort of North Stars and then shorter term, but then how do we know that we're getting there, and how are we tracking that, and how are we, again, keeping our eye on any risks that might get in our way. I think that our papers are very focused in that way now. So we, like I said, we're always learning, and I'm sure that we will continue to iterate. But that pack that we, engage the board with regularly is thoughtful, it's intentional, it's a good use of time. It is, for a purpose that we all understand. And so that the time that we have together, I think, it is really well managed, and we can actually progress the agenda of the organisation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it speaks to something we think about and talk about a lot at Achates, which is getting as kind of specific and granular about the key results you're looking for in an impact sense and an outcome sense for your audiences, for the work that you're creating, as you do in every organization for kind of financial and operational things, which might feel more easy to kind of put those shorter term markers on. But something we really advocate for in the sector is every organization being able to define that and understand that in a shared way, in that really tangible way. So that's really helpful and great to hear you're working like that at the Women's Prize Trust. Claire, over to you now, and I was going to ask if you could share an example of where strategic clarity from the board, like Anna's just been talking about, has allowed you to then succeed in your executive role.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. In preparation for this call, I've been thinking about instances, and so many come to mind. And obviously, we've talked about sort of the sector, the socio-political landscape changing constantly at the moment, in the last, say, 5 years since we've become a charity. Those examples have changed, but of course, some of them are still very, prevalent and probably always will be. The funding, for instance, is always, where the board and the exec need to work really closely together. The point that I want to make, though, or that really struck me when thinking about answering this question, was actually how the board, through various examples of needing strategic clarity, has actually really coached me through those live examples to enable me to think more strategically, and therefore get to a place where now I think we operate, which is either I'm able to make some more decisions independently of the board, or picking up on what Anna was saying, thinking about a recommendation to the board. So working through a situation myself, looking at it from all angles strategically, and knowing really, or sort of trying to preempt the questions that the board might ask. Thinking, how are they going to make their decision? What are the factors are they going to ask me about? What are they, Anna was talking about trade-offs, so for instance, if we talk about a project, which does come to mind as an example, where when I first became executive director, I felt in a sort of gut instinct way, wasn't quite delivering as we wanted it to. But of course, didn't necessarily express it in a strategic way to the board, or perhaps there were lots of questions that came back from them. Why? What decisions, do we need to make? What would that look like? What are the risks? What are the benefits? All those types of things, and in a sort of cost benefit analysis, looking at the trade-offs in a decision-making framework. And Anna in particular has coached me through that so well now on so many different occasions that I do that thought pattern quite naturally myself now, and therefore am bringing to the board often recommendations of laying out, this is the situation. These are the factors, these are the, in a succinct way, the information I think you need to know. Here is a recommendation. What do you think? And of course, because the board is, full of experienced women from many different sectors, lots of, different backgrounds, and also experience on other boards as well, which is very, very helpful for us as a charity, that they sort of bring all that knowledge and information in and that insight. There will be questions or things that we haven't thought about, or other viewpoints. That often we can come to decisions on strategic matters quite quickly, and we are aligned quite quickly. So a lot of the work is actually done in advance of, say, a board meeting or a discussion on a strategic point. And later, I think we will touch on subcommittees as well. A lot of the work for our board is actually done through, sort of devolved through subcommittees. Which allows deep dives, more time, much more relevant experience in a particular matter. And then that allows us to sort of strategically move on. Now, I suppose I've been thinking about it in terms of also a problem, a challenge. So thinking about funding or, a socio-political issue, for instance. But also what the board does strategically is push me. It encourages me to be really, really ambitious, balancing it with risk, of course, and that sort of mitigation. And I think that is also really valuable to us as an organization, that they are bold and passionate and want absolutely, the star on a stick for us. And I think that as well has, in a really positive sense, sort of pushed me to sort of dream and think a bit bigger for the organization as well. So I think it works both ways. But, rather than a specific example, I'm sure you can all think of, ways or examples where you have needed sort of the board's strategic input. I think the sort of really key point that has struck me is that I want to think strategically as well as an executive director. And the board, through working with the board over a number of years, has really enabled me to think what's best practice here? How can we make this interaction really smooth, efficient, and get to the sort of the best outcome for the organization. So that's what I would sort of take from that. And I think it's important for people to figure out how they can do that, for their organization. What kind of my training's been, fairly informal, almost learning on the job through these examples, where I've needed sort of strategic guidance from the board. There will always be more in the future, but I think, thinking about arming me with, with those sort of really good thought practices as well has been hugely beneficial to me, and I think the organization.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the kind of rapidly changing external environment, and it's something that I think a lot about how we set up strategy and ways of working strategically that isn't kind of we make all the decisions and then we do all of the things, but instead having these frameworks and structures that allow you to respond, allow you to have that kind of shared understanding. And I think what you've just talked about is a really great example of that in action. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, Claire. A question for both of you now, which is, and you've kind of alluded to lots of them already in what you've been saying, but I just wanted to ask what you see as the kind of qualities of this successful partnership between board and executive, and for those who might be listening today, how can they establish, reset, strengthen the relationships that they might have?
I can start. Some of these are, by the way, sequential, I think, because you can't have one without the other. So, for instance, one that I think is really important, that I feel pretty good about, certainly between Claire and I, and between the board and the executive team, but we'll never take for granted, and that we actively work on, is having this idea of psychological safety. And what I practically mean by that is being able to have an environment, so that's time together, a meeting, in which we can talk about uncertainty, have tension, constructive tension, have multiple perspectives coming from all of those kind of smart, experienced people who may not see the world in kind of unanimous terms, and that's good, but we can use all of that, and that can come together to, make better decisions, make a better organization, have a more significant impact to deliver our purpose more fulsomely. Now, however, when I was thinking about that as a quality, I realize it's kind of an outcome that we strive for. It's not something you can't just say, oh, tick, I've got psychological safety now. So in order to get there, there are things that we actively try to do. And I suppose maybe I'll start with continuing this idea of clarity. So we talked about clarity of expectations, but maybe to be more precise, I'll talk about the clarity of roles. Like, what is it your job to do now? And we have codified this, for instance, in things like delegation of responsibilities, which we have documented. And we have very clearly talked about the fact that Claire and her team have autonomy for these decisions, and that this is the process when, when it is not this happy path, when a decision is bigger than that. And here is the process by which you will access the right people in the board in the right order to do that. We're very clear on that. And I think that in moments of stress, that is really helpful because we can, know where our lane is so that we stay in it. And that's one of the contributing factors, I think, that allows us to get to this sort of safe psychological space. Claire, I'm going to hand it to you. I have more, but pick it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first item on my list was, it sort of comes back to the point around the recruitment and onboarding of trustees and staff. I think is a real understanding, or a shared understanding, of the organisation and its vision and its values. And of course, in charity, we can talk about that quite a lot. It can sit there on a website about us page, and it can be there in our annual returns to the Charity Commission. But perhaps because we're a fairly new charity as well, I feel that we talk about it a lot at the Women's Prize Trust. And it really is something that we have and do interrogate a lot and are always thinking about. And for the board and the exec, where you often have decisions to make about, well, do we do this or do we do that with limited resource and capacity? What is the right decision? Going back to those decision-making frameworks, etc. I think it's really, really crucial that both the board and the exec are totally bought in and understand what you're doing it all for, what the organisation is actually trying to achieve, how, challenges, of course, but being fully in on that together. And I kind of think you do need some time to live it and breathe it and to actually understand it. You need to experience the work and the impact and the audience and the beneficiaries. You need to see it to really understand it, I think, and to kind of feel it's magic, But I think that can really bring a board and an exec together, that they truly understand why they are doing it. And that's not to say there won't be bumps along the road or, yes, challenges. But I think that really helps kind of bring you together as a team. And so that for me is, I've as I said, sort of feel very fortunate. I feel like we're at that place with the Women's Prize, that we're all in. And we all are on the same page, and that's a really lovely place to be. But that's not to say that there aren't challenges and things you have to figure out, coming down the line as well. But I think that shared kind of understanding and purpose and passion really, really helps.
Yeah. And I really love, Claire, there how you, in kind of defining that understanding of purpose, you touched on both kind of articulating it and having that clear shared framework of what that looks like, but also seeing it and feeling it and getting those opportunities to kind of, for the board who can be more removed, to really, see firsthand the work that an organisation is doing, which I think is often, missed or a kind of missed opportunity for cultural sector organisations. Fantastic. I'm conscious we could probably do a whole one of these sessions on just the qualities, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us on and ask a bit about kind of processes and structures, if that's all right. So we talked about how it's easy to kind of reduce governance to just reporting and board papers and agendas that don't leave that space for bigger picture thinking and conversation. And it sounds like you've kind of made some progress in cracking this at the Women's Prize Trust. So I'd be interested to hear practically what you think, what structures and processes we can actually use to bridge that gap between board and executive and empower this kind of work.
Anna, you're the process queen. Do you want to lead, or shall I talk about your agendas?
Well, why don't I start, and then we can fill in for one another, because I sort of did think a lot about this. And I do think that there is, magic in having things well kind of codified and documented, that you can then be very creative around, and then you really understand, what you're there for, why you're there. It's not just about a shared vision, it's a shared accountability and understanding what the contributing parts, the different components bring to delivering that accountability and that vision. And so we have, sets of kind of materials that I think are very helpful. We really have now got to a place where our agendas for board meetings are, I think, well done. So they are strategy first. We really think about what is it we need to know now, and how does that contribute to that long-term vision. So our strategy doesn't change, but the things that we need to do, may change as we go along, or the challenges that we face. We're really clear when we're in in a meeting, in a call together, why these things are being put on the table. I mean, down to the specific, is this for discussion? Is this for decision? Is this for update? What needs to be shared, and what do I need from you, trustees? Don't feel like everybody needs to make a comment if that's not what I've asked for, And so we're pretty clear about, Claire talked earlier about making sure that what we bring in has a purpose to be there. It contributes to our strategic focus, to what we're trying to do. We know what we're asking of the trustees. We're giving them the very relevant information that, anticipating what they're going to need to do that. But again, we really codify that in the agenda. We're very explicit to say, this is what this is for, this is what we need, what's going to happen next. I think Claire mentioned things like subcommittees. We have, devolved power structure in some areas where things which are going to need deeper consideration sets can go to subgroups of experts. So let's say, personnel decisions or something like that. And then we will bring in the summary of what we had discussed, what the considerations were, what the trade-off and what the recommendation is. The board still collectively will sign that off. They can ask questions, but they know that there are some trustees who have been very deeply immersed in that information so far. And so there's this, both degree of trust in the time that they have spent, and the ability to ask questions of them, and to know that something has really been well considered. And then we also talked about that decision-making framework. The project that you talked about earlier, Claire, I know which one you mean. And I recall that one of the unlocks for us understanding whether we should continue with it or not, and communicating to the board why that was a recommendation, was again having a very clear decision-making framework based on, here is our long-term objective, here are our shorter-term needs, so objectives and key results. Here is how a hierarchy of decision-making should work. Does it contribute to this, or this? It doesn't contribute to them in a material way that we can measure, and that we can understand that the trade-off that we're making, and that could be in time costs, money that we're outlaying, very real resources that we have to put in to deliver this, that is taking away from these other things. If we cannot, justify that in a value measure clearly, then the answer has to be no. And I think that flowchart sort of process was pretty helpful, particularly in something as we all, working in a creative environment. It almost feels countercultural that we want to do those things. I understand that, and that's why I started by saying there is a creativity and something that frees you up by being able to get down on paper almost, this is what we need to continue to be sustainable, to continue to deliver what we all sign up to. These things have to be true. So let's just check whether they're true. And that, it's not a creative judgment, actually. And that can be a different decision and discussion. But I found that those work products, those processes have been really helpful for us. Claire, continue where I've left off if there's anything I've left.
I mean, yes, I agree with all of that. Whilst it's technically not I suppose, a structure or a process to answer the question, it feels like we have various modes of interaction between the board and the exec, and that kind of communication strategy for us is really, really helpful as well. It means that we are quite nimble as a team of very busy women. So we have figured out kind of the really formal meeting points, obviously meetings, documents. There is an all group, WhatsApp, all board WhatsApp group, things like that, which is actually a new thing, but works really well for certain types of communications. But then there is also, the much more sort of, personalized communications. So, everyone is busy, and we're always very respectful of that. So, everyone has a day job. All our trustees are volunteers. WhatsApp between Anna and myself, for instance, allows me to really engage with Anna in a quick, agile way across time zones. It has, of course, taken time to build up. That won't be suitable for everyone. But that kind of communication process, really, is what it is, enables me to move forward week by week in a really, really smart way. And I think figuring out how you communicate is a really key thing for you as an organization. So I think for us, it's enabled us to be smart and nimble, and in a remote working team, in a small team, with people on different time zones, incredibly busy, etc. Anna and I do most of our work on WhatsApp, on the move, or in the evenings. That works for us. That will not necessarily work for another partner. So I think figuring out how you can do that is really, really key, and sort of what is the right style for you. But I think the basis of codifying your cadence, your more formal interactions, the documents that you need, how the board want to work. And that is something I actually ask each new board member as they roll on. Let's have a conversation about ways of working here. How do you want to work? Do you have an EA who helps with your diary? Are you happy for me to WhatsApp you? Are there particular days of the week that you do not want me to contact you because that's a day off? All of those things, they're important human concerns that I think actually asking those questions up front really helps establish kind of a sort of a great working organization.
It's interesting across what both of you have just shared. There's this kind of coming back to the word codifying, and actually just this idea of across realms, whether that's in our agendas or in our flowcharts and our processes or in our relationships, having that clarity and kind of setting some of that out intentionally is the fundamental thing here. It not necessarily what that process is or how that relationship looks, but just really, really codifying that. So that's definitely something I'm taking away with me from this conversation. I'm conscious of time, and a couple more things I wanted to ask you both. So if okay, I'm going to move to asking you about succession planning, just building on what you were saying there, Claire, and kind of how you recruit new people into these relationships and partnerships. So how can we succession plan our relationships between the executive and non-executive so that dynamic partnerships like the one that the two of you have built aren't lost when a trustee or staff member moves on?
To kick that off, I mean, I think it's coming back to the point that Anna made around being really clear about expectations. So we have role profiles for trustees and different subcommittee membership, just as we would if we were recruiting a paid member of staff. And I think that's really, really crucial. Also thinking about, of course, yes, the gaps in any role, whether it was, say a trustee or a senior leadership role, but also trying to think, of course, to forward plan it, to future proof it. So you're not just recruiting or thinking about maybe the gap that you are filling, the person who is leaving, but also where you are heading as an organization and the type of skills and experience that you need to help get you there. I think understanding no matter how wonderful and amazing a relationship is between two people or between a board and an exec team, really accepting that things change as well, and that's healthy. Actually, it's really, really healthy. That's good governance for an organization, that things change, people move on. Organizations are led by different people with different inputs and different insights, and organizations will require different things and different experts at that time. And I think the last thing I would say is ensuring that any one relationship is not overly dominant. Sort of comes back to that point of letting, I suppose, or ensuring that trustees see the work and feel part of the work and are sort of co-creating that with the exec team as well, rather than being at a distance and the exec team just delivering it. Spreading that love and risk of it all I think is really key. But what that means is that, for instance, it can't all be held by two people, by, say, an executive director and a chair, for instance. I work really hard to develop relationships with all of my trustees, and I know that I will learn different things from each of them, and they will all contribute to the organization in different ways. But of course, then if you have a whole board who has a relationship and knows all of the exec team, or vice versa, if you have, an exec team and an ED who has relationships with all of the board, it ensures that when any one person changes or is no longer involved, that the organization is protected. There is enough continuity there. Obviously, time is key for succession planning as well, enough time, but that there are enough of the right people with the right experience and understanding and knowledge of the organization to really safeguard it and sort of shepherd it through to its next iteration. Anna.
I have very little to add. Absolutely right, everything you said, and all of those things that we talked around, documenting decision rights, strategic priorities, expectations of ways of working, all of those things, they help. We have onboarding manuals which will continue to evolve, but they help because they have crystallized kind of what our hopes and expectations at least have been, and we will continue to evolve them.
Yeah, I really love, just returning to the conversation we were having about risk earlier in this conversation, this idea of actually spreading those relationships and fostering those relationships across the exec and board. And that might be particular kind of between key people or many to many, but that as a risk management process and as a risk management measure, I think is a really lovely idea. So final question, if that's all right to you both. I mentioned at the start in my introduction that a new charity governance code came out at the end of 2025. And so I was just wondering if you could set your own code of practice, and I guess reflecting on today's conversation, what 3 rules would you ask your executive and non-executive colleagues to follow?
Okay, I'll start. I think it's super important to be very clear about the role that you're playing. Understand your role, really understand it, and then stay in it. And so I'll start with number 1. Claire, do you want to go to number 2? You're still muted. Had to happen at some point.
Number 2 for me would be keep purpose front and center, particularly at moments of challenge, stress, crisis even. Return to it as your guiding star and it will help you. It is more than a thing that lives on a website. You should know it inside out and think about it constantly.
I fully agree. And then maybe it's perhaps an extension of that point is in practical ways, the way you manage your board, so maybe talking to chairs, do make sure that you explicitly protect space for long-term thinking, which is often very connected to your purpose, particularly in those times of short-term pressure.
Yeah. And I think for that final point, going back to what you were saying about codifying the agenda and, what's for discussion, what's for decision, what's for information, but also just having that reflection about actually how much of this time is operational, is kind of tick box thinking and stuff that we need to cover, but how much of it is that more expansive thought. I think it's a really useful, practical way of doing that. I love that. I was as you were speaking today, I've been kind of thinking about what my key themes coming out of it, and you've really beautifully summarized them in your 3 rules for other people. So that's great. I had that idea of being really intentional and really clear, having the shared purpose and really living those shared values, and then this balance between kind of consistency and having a shared framing that everyone is bought into, but also where you maybe personalize that and make that an inclusive thing for different people and different needs. So yeah, your rules almost perfectly aligned with what I took away from the conversations. That's great. Thank you both so much for your input today. This has been an enormously interesting conversation for me, and I'm sure for those watching. I really appreciate you sharing your time, sharing your expertise with us, and lots to take away to our own practice. Thank you to those of you who are watching. I hope this has been enjoyable for you, interesting for you. If you want to have a follow-up conversation or have questions about anything we've discussed today, then you're welcome to email me. I'll make sure that my email is in the bio below. If this conversation has got you thinking about your own governance practice and how you balance that oversight of purpose, as well as the more practical elements, then do explore that new trustee membership of the Achates community that I mentioned. That's where there are bespoke modules for trustees, which explore some of these topics in more detail. And if you are a staff member, kind of secretly hoping you could reset the relationship with your board to something more in line with what Anna and Claire have shared with us today, then remember that your membership to Achates community gives you that 3-month free trial for a trustee, so that you can use that as a bit of a lever to get some of these conversations onto the agenda. I think that's everything. So I will say one final huge thank you to our speakers and goodbye to you all. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.